31 years of waking up at dawn, navigating toxic corporate politics, and managing people who didn't want to be managed was finally behind me. The ultimate prize was supposed to be a peaceful retirement. My wife, Sarah, and I had sacrificed and saved for decades to secure our dream escape, a beautiful waterfront property in Silver Lake, Ohio. It featured 3 bedrooms, a stunning wraparound porch, and a level of absolute stillness I hadn't experienced in 30 years. We packed up our life and moved in on a crisp October morning, watching the early mist rise off the water from our new deck. Sarah gently pressed my hand, and in that moment, no words were necessary. For 8 wonderful months, our life was pure bliss. I had no idea that this very peace was about to be turned into a weapon against us. Our daughter, Chloe, had married a man named Tyler 2 years earlier. To be completely candid, I always had my doubts about him. I kept my mouth shut at the wedding because I am not the type of person to create drama within my own family, but I noticed Tyler's true colors very early on. He possessed a unique habit of speaking in a firm, authoritative tone that made his personal demands sound like absolute facts. He spoke as if saying no to him was completely outside the realm of possibility. Sarah viewed it as professional confidence, but I saw it as something entirely different. They lived less than an hour away from us in a standard cookie-cutter housing development where every single home looked identical. Tyler worked in commercial property management, while Chloe was an elementary school teacher. Together, they had a 4-year-old son named Mason, who was the absolute light of our lives. On the final Friday of June, they drove out to our place for an outdoor dinner. I fired up the grill while Sarah prepared her special homemade potato salad, the premium recipe with whole grain mustard, not the quick version she makes when she is exhausted. We enjoyed our meal out on the deck while young Mason chased fireflies around the yard. It was an incredibly peaceful evening, the exact kind of beautiful night that causes you to let your guard down completely. That was the precise moment Tyler set down his drink, leaned forward with his elbows on the table like he was pitch meeting a client, and said, "So, Dad, Sarah, we wanted to discuss something with you. In my entire life, I have never once heard a positive sentence that started with those specific words. My parents, Arthur and Evelyn, have been going through a really difficult patch lately," Tyler began. I was already well aware of their situation. Arthur had been forced into an early retirement due to severe chronic back pain, and Evelyn had a grating personality that seemed to drain the energy out of any room she walked into. They had been stuck in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city ever since selling their family home 2 years prior, and Tyler had mentioned before that they were miserable there. Up until that second, I had safely categorized their misery as none of my business. Sarah asked what kind of trouble they were facing, and Tyler explained it was mostly financial, compounded by Arthur's failing health. He claimed they desperately needed a quiet environment with more physical space. Tyler paused, letting the heavy silence hang over the table before delivering his real pitch. He suggested that, just as a temporary fix, his parents could come live with us at our waterfront home. The entire deck fell completely silent. A lone bird called out across the lake, and I remember thinking that the bird and I were completely on the same page. I asked him to define what he meant by temporary, and he quickly responded that it would only be for 3 or 4 months, just until they could get back on their feet. I looked over at Sarah, and Sarah looked back at me. Chloe was staring intently at the wooden table, suddenly acting as if the pattern in the grain was the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. I carefully told Tyler that this was our private home. He nodded smoothly, claiming he understood completely, but wouldn't ask if it weren't an absolute emergency because they were family. Sarah placed a calming hand on my arm and told him we would need some time to think it over. Tyler immediately smiled, and I noted right then that his smile appeared before Sarah had even finished her sentence. It was the look of a man who believed the entire discussion was a mere formality and that our eventual agreement was already guaranteed. I kept my mouth shut for the rest of the night, but my mind was already racing. The entire following week turned into what I can only describe as a relentless corporate sales campaign. Tyler sent constant text messages, Chloe called multiple times, and Evelyn, who hadn't called my phone once in 2 full years, left an 8-minute voicemail pleading for someone to just believe in them. Even Arthur sent a handwritten letter, which briefly impressed me until I realized the wording was clearly dictated by his wife. Slowly, Sarah began to soften. I watched the hesitation leave her in real time. My wife is a deeply compassionate woman, sometimes entirely too kind for her own good. She started rationalizing the situation, mentioning that it was only a temporary favor, that they were truly drowning financially, and that having little Mason's other grandparents close by would be wonderful for our grandson. I listened quietly and nodded, but I refused to make any firm commitments. A few days later, Tyler showed up at our house completely alone, without Chloe, and took a seat right across from me at the kitchen table with that same aggressive boardroom posture. He told me he could sense some hesitation on my part. I told him he had sharp instincts. Without missing a single beat, he casually asked what I was even using our third bedroom for anyway, since it was mostly just sitting there as storage space. I stared back at him for a long, quiet moment. I told him very clearly that the third bedroom was a guest room reserved for visitors we actually chose to invite, and that his parents were not guests I had invited. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat and muttered that he assumed family didn't require a formal invitation to help each other out. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that family is simply a word people love to weaponize when they want to take something without asking properly. We locked eyes in a tense standoff. It was the very first time I had ever dropped the polite act and spoken to him with total, unvarnished honesty, and I could tell he was completely caught off guard. Then he delivered a line that I will never forget. He leaned in and said that he wasn't planning on bringing it up, but Chloe was incredibly stressed out over this entire situation. He claimed that when Chloe gets stressed, it puts a massive strain on their marriage, and when their marriage suffers, it directly impacts little Mason. I sat there and analyzed every single layer of that statement. My son-in-law had just casually held my daughter's marital happiness and my grandson's psychological stability over my head like a threat to force my hand. I didn't lose my cool. Instead, I simply smiled and told him I would discuss it with Sarah. He left our house looking incredibly satisfied, believing he had won. I stood by the front window, watched his car disappear around the curve of the road, and made a cold, calculated decision that I have never regretted for a single second since. I agreed to let them move in, but not before making a very important phone call. My old friend Jessica, a brilliant woman I had worked alongside for over a decade, had transitioned into a private home security consulting business after retiring from our firm. She was the sharpest operator I knew. I called her the very night Tyler made his threat. I explained that I needed a top-tier camera system, devices that could capture everything happening both inside and outside the property, installed entirely out of sight before my new house guests arrived. Jessica went quiet on the line for a moment before asking what exactly I was planning. I told her I wasn't planning anything. I was simply documenting. She let out a long, knowing laugh. 3 days later, Jessica and her technician arrived at the house. They installed a total of 6 high-definition cameras, 1 monitoring the front entrance, 1 in the main living room, 1 facing the kitchen, 1 covering the back porch, 1 at the base of the staircase, and 1 tracking the driveway. The entire network synced directly to an app on my smartphone and backed up to a secure cloud server. Every single device was motion-activated and recorded crystal-clear audio. I did my homework beforehand to ensure the setup was completely legal within our state. Once the security system was live, Sarah and I packed up our birth certificates, financial records, and irreplaceable personal items, moving them into the locked home office located right off our primary bedroom. Sarah watched me carry the heavy boxes into the office and told me I was being completely dramatic. I told her she was probably right. I deliberately chose not to mention the hidden cameras to her just yet. It wasn't because I kept secrets from my wife, I never do, but because I knew that if she was aware of the lenses, her behavior would change. I needed every single person in that house to act completely naturally. I had no idea at the time, but those hidden lenses were the exact things that were going to save our future. Arthur and Evelyn officially moved in on a Thursday afternoon. The moment Evelyn stepped across the threshold, she looked around and remarked that the place was cozy, using a tone that made it sound like a polite insult for a house much smaller than she felt she deserved. She immediately began inspecting the space, running her fingers over the custom curtains, the granite countertops, and the framed photos on the walls as if she were a property appraiser. Arthur was much quieter than his wife. His chronic back trouble was visibly genuine. He moved with extreme care, and I found myself feeling a small, reluctant wave of sympathy for the man. He shook my hand firmly and expressed sincere gratitude for our hospitality. I knew I could easily coexist with Arthur. Evelyn, however, was an entirely different story. Within 48 hours of moving in, she had completely rearranged our downstairs living space. I walked downstairs on Saturday morning to find our sofa pushed against a completely different wall. Worse, my favorite leather reading chair, the one I had owned since 2019 and spent 6 long months breaking in, had been shoved into a far corner at a bizarre 90-degree angle, forcing whoever sat in it to face nothing but a blank wall. I managed to maintain an exceptional amount of patience as I asked Evelyn if she had shifted the furniture around. She replied brightly that she had, claiming the original arrangement lacked proper flow and that this new setup was vastly superior. Arthur looked up from his morning newspaper and gently reminded her that this wasn't their house. Evelyn completely ignored her husband and immediately began rambling about how the space desperately needed new throw pillows. The moment she looked away, I dragged my reading chair back to its rightful spot. She deliberately moved it back to the corner the very next afternoon while I was out at the local hardware store. I moved it right back again. We repeated this silent battle 3 separate times before I realized my energy was better spent elsewhere. Meanwhile, the hidden cameras were silently capturing every single interaction. During their second week under our roof, the first major warning sign appeared on my phone. I was sitting out on the back deck enjoying a quiet cup of coffee at 6:15 in the morning, my absolute favorite hour of the day, when my smartphone buzzed with a notification. It was a motion alert from the kitchen camera. I opened the security app and watched Evelyn standing by the kitchen island on a phone call. She was speaking in that distinct, hushed tone people use when they mistakenly believe they are completely alone. I slid the volume slider all the way up. She was telling the person on the other end that our home had an incredible amount of space, noting that the 3rd bedroom was perfectly empty now that they were utilizing it. Then, she mentioned the locked home office off our main bedroom, speculating about what we were keeping inside. Evelyn continued whispering into the phone, dismissing Arthur's complaints by claiming this was the healthiest he had felt in years. She explicitly told Tyler that if they played their cards right, they could easily turn this into a permanent living situation, especially since Sarah and I traveled so frequently and would leave the property completely vacant half the time. I turned off the screen and sat in absolute stillness as a blue heron glided down and landed gracefully at the edge of our dock. The bird stood completely motionless, waiting with the exact kind of calm patience I had just decided to adopt. I walked back inside the house, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and didn't utter a single word about what I had just witnessed. I smiled warmly when Evelyn wished me a good morning, and I genuinely asked if Arthur needed any fresh ice packs for his back. My pleasant demeanor should have absolutely terrified her. I quickly sent a text message to Jessica, letting her know that the footage I was gathering was pure gold, and she texted back, telling me to save absolutely everything. By the time the 3rd week arrived, the broader strategy became glaringly obvious. Tyler began dropping by our place far too frequently for it to be considered a casual family visit. He and Evelyn would hold long, intense strategy sessions out on the back deck, completely under the impression that their conversations were entirely private. They had no idea that the microphone clarity on the upper corner of the roof was absolutely flawless. Listening to the accumulated audio from those outdoor meetings, it became clear that Evelyn was fully convinced Sarah and I would eventually submit to a permanent arrangement. Tyler had repeatedly assured his mother that all they needed to do was buy more time. Interestingly, Chloe's name was never brought up as a participant in these discussions, which proved to me that she was entirely oblivious to the scheme and that her marital stress had been completely fabricated by Tyler as a tool to manipulate me. Arthur, on the other hand, had been explicitly promised by Tyler that this was nothing more than a brief 3-month favor. He actually brought this up to Evelyn during a private argument on the porch, telling her that they needed to stick to the agreed timeline. Evelyn snapped at him to stop being so rigid, prompting Arthur to mutter a frustrated curse before slamming the door and walking back inside. I was genuinely starting to feel a sense of respect for Arthur. Later that same evening, I was sitting out on the dock by myself when Arthur walked down the steps and carefully lowered himself into the neighboring chair, groaning slightly from his back pain. We sat in a comfortable silence for several minutes before he looked over and told me directly that he had never wanted to impose on us like this. I told him I knew that. He sighed, noting that his wife always had grand ideas, which I assumed was the most diplomatic phrasing he could possibly use. I countered that Tyler seemed to have plenty of ideas of his own, and Arthur simply stared out at the water, muttering that his son unfortunately inherited that trait entirely from Evelyn's side of the family. We sat there together on the dock for a few more minutes, the water gently lapping against the wood. I decided it was time to get some clarity. I turned to Arthur and asked him directly if Tyler had told him that Sarah and I were on board with a permanent living arrangement. Arthur hesitated for a long moment before admitting that Tyler had assured them we were completely open to the idea. There it was, the definitive proof of the deception. I looked Arthur in the eye and told him flatly that we were absolutely not open to it. A wave of realization washed over his face. It wasn't shame, but rather the heavy look of a man who had suspected a painful truth for a long time and just had it officially confirmed. He simply muttered that he understood, and we left it at that for the night. The entire situation completely exploded during the 5th week. I was navigating the produce aisle at the local grocery store with Sarah when my smartphone vibrated violently in my pocket. It was a motion notification from the living room security camera. I pulled up the application and was stunned to see Tyler standing inside my house. He hadn't called, he hadn't texted, and he had simply let himself in. As I watched the screen, I realized Evelyn had taken the spare house key from the hook next to our front door and given it to her son without ever asking us. Tyler was actively walking across our living room holding a metal measuring tape. Evelyn was walking right beside him, gesturing toward the walls and talking about how they could easily tear down a specific partition to split the large living room into 2 separate living spaces. Suddenly, a third voice echoed through the speaker. It was Chloe. I felt a sudden rush of relief that my daughter was there, followed instantly by a sick, hollow feeling in my stomach as I realized she had been dragged into my home under false pretenses while her husband planned an unauthorized renovation. Chloe sounded incredibly uncomfortable on the recording, telling Tyler that they shouldn't be doing this while we weren't home. Tyler dismissively barked back that it didn't matter, because this was about the future of their family. I stood frozen in the grocery store, watching my son-in-law measure my walls while his mother picked out load-bearing structures to demolish. Sarah was standing right next to me holding a bag of fresh apples. She noticed my expression and asked if everything was all right. I looked at her and told her that things were very far from all right and that we needed to drive home immediately. I wish I could tell you that I stormed through the front door and completely lost my temper. That would certainly be the dramatic version of the story. The satisfying, explosive moment where a betrayed man finally roars. But that is not what happened. Instead, as I pulled into our gravel driveway and saw Tyler's car parked outside, a profound sense of calm settled deep into my chest. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet, cold clarity that had been steadily building over the last 5 weeks, and it had just finished locking itself into place. I walked into the house with total composure. The moment Chloe saw my expression, all the color completely drained from her face. She whispered a quiet greeting while Tyler spun around quickly, still holding the metal measuring tape tightly in his hand. For a fraction of a second, he looked exactly like a thief caught red-handed, but his professional corporate mask slipped right back on to cover the panic. He smoothly greeted me and claimed they were just taking a few quick measurements. I looked at him, gestured toward the tape measure, and casually asked whose house he was measuring for. He stammered slightly, claiming they were just brainstorming some long-term concepts for down the road. I smiled warmly and suggested that everyone take a seat so we could talk. As we gathered around the kitchen island, Sarah was completely reading the room, watching my face with the intense focus she uses when she knows a major shift is happening and is deciding whether or not to step in. I gave her a very brief, reassuring look, and she chose to remain completely silent. I told the group I had something very interesting to show them, pulled out my smartphone, opened the security app, and pressed play on the crystal-clear audio recording of Evelyn's secret kitchen phone call from week 2. The entire room fell into a suffocating silence. Evelyn's face twisted into an incredibly complex expression of pure shock. Tyler immediately tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and calmly stated that recording audio was completely legal in our state under single-party consent laws. Furthermore, I reminded him that this was my primary residence and the security system was fully disclosed within the property records. Evelyn looked horrified, accusing me of spying on them in my own home. I corrected her, stating that I was simply documenting my own property, a precaution I felt necessary to take after being told my family needed a brief 3-month favor, only to catch them plotting a permanent takeover behind my back. Chloe slowly turned her gaze toward Tyler, and the look on her face was completely unprecedented. It was the look of a person doing some heavy math very quickly and absolutely detesting the final answer. She quietly asked her husband if he had lied to his own parents about the timeline, and if he had fabricated her marital stress just to use her as a tool to pressure me. Tyler's jaw tightened into a rigid line as Chloe realized the depth of the deception, telling him in a chillingly quiet voice that he had completely used her. I didn't stop there. I kept my voice completely level and laid out the rest of the evidence, detail by detail. I played the fresh recording of the measuring tape conversation from just moments before. I brought up the missing house key that Evelyn had secretly taken from our wall hook and handed over to Tyler without a word of permission. Finally, I looked over at Arthur and brought up our honest conversation down on the dock, confirming out loud that Tyler had outright lied to his own father by claiming Sarah and I were open to a permanent arrangement before we had ever even agreed to the temporary one. I never once raised my voice. I simply watched Tyler desperately try to regain control of the room, executing every corporate pivot, redirection, and soft-spoken excuse he knew. He was incredibly smooth, I'll give him that. But absolutely no amount of professional polish works when the man across from you is holding the literal audio files. Eventually, Evelyn tried to push back, looking at me with pure disdain and calling my actions incredibly cold. I looked her dead in the eye and reminded her that she had sat right here in my kitchen and referred to my hard-earned family home as a piece of real estate on a private phone call she thought no one would ever hear. I told her to be very careful with how she chose to use the word cold. Arthur had quietly walked into the room during the confrontation and was standing right in the kitchen doorway. He caught my eye and gave me a very small, respectful nod. It wasn't necessarily an endorsement of my methods, but it was a clear acknowledgement of the facts. That was when I delivered the final terms I'd been constructing for the past 5 weeks, telling Tyler and his parents that they had exactly 2 weeks to pack their things and find alternative living arrangements. Tyler scoffed, claiming I couldn't possibly be serious. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had never been more serious about anything in my entire life that didn't involve a bank mortgage. He turned to Chloe, pleading for her to step in, but Chloe just shook her head, stating clearly that this was our home. Evelyn chimed in, demanding to know how I could treat family this way. I looked at her and told her very clearly that real family doesn't sneak into a person's house uninvited, map out unauthorized construction projects, and completely lie about the fundamental terms of an agreement. I told her that isn't family. That is a hostile corporate takeover. The following 2 weeks were anything but quiet. Tyler tried 3 completely distinct manipulation tactics to break our resolve. He tried appealing directly to Chloe, he tried pleading with Sarah, and he attempted to construct an elaborate web of guilt, weaving an argument that our refusal to house his parents forever was a direct attack on his marriage, his son, and the stability of the entire family unit. By that point, Sarah had sat down and watched every single minute of the security recordings herself. She listened to the outdoor deck conversations, including the specific moment where Evelyn explicitly explained to Tyler that Sarah was the weak link in our marriage, claiming that if they just kept applying pressure to her, she would eventually cave. My wife is a lot of things, but weak is absolutely not one of them. On the 10th day of the countdown, Evelyn tried to push her luck in the kitchen, and Sarah looked at her and told her to get out of her sight. She used a cold, razor-sharp tone that I hadn't heard from her once in 34 years of marriage, and I sincerely hope she never directs it at me. Evelyn practically sprinted out of the room. On the 12th day, Chloe drove up to the house completely alone to see me. We walked down to the dock and sat in the quiet. She looked out at the water and told me softly that she had absolutely no idea about the permanent plan or the lies Tyler had been feeding everyone. She looked completely broken, and she pleaded with me to believe her. I looked at my daughter, and I didn't see an adult woman caught in a family scandal. I saw the 4-year-old girl who used to chase fireflies in the grass, the 17-year-old sitting nervously in the driver's seat asking me to teach her how to parallel park, and the shattered expression on her face when she realized her husband had weaponized her trust. I wrapped my arm around her, pulled her close, and told her that I knew she was innocent and that I wasn't angry with her at all. Chloe rested her head heavily on my shoulder as we sat there in the silence. After a long while, she choked back a tear and whispered that she realized she needed to have some incredibly difficult conversations when she got back home. I squeezed her shoulder and told her that I thought that was a very wise decision. The official moving day arrived on a Tuesday morning. At my usual hour of 6:15, I was sitting out on the deck with my first cup of coffee when Arthur slowly walked down the steps toward me, holding a small travel bag in his hand. He carefully set the bag down on the wooden planks, turned to face me, and extended his hand. He looked me straight in the eye and told me that he owed me a sincere apology. I told him he didn't owe me anything, but Arthur shook his head, admitting he should have demanded answers about the moving timeline much sooner. He confessed that he suspected things weren't right from the start, but he had chosen to let Evelyn handle everything simply because it was easier than dealing with an argument. He looked down and called his own silence cowardly. I looked at his posture and reminded him that he was dealing with a severe medical issue, telling him he just needed to choose his battles wisely. A faint, genuine smile crossed his face as he shook my hand, telling me I was a decent man and joking that I shouldn't let anyone else find out. With that, he turned and left. Evelyn walked past me to the car a few minutes later without uttering a single word, wearing the bitter expression of a woman actively storing a grudge for future weaponization. I silently stored one right back. Tyler was the last one to leave the house. He stood right at the threshold of the back deck, clutching his car keys tightly in his hand. He looked out at me and muttered that he hoped this entire situation wouldn't end up permanently defining our relationship. I took a slow sip from my coffee cup and looked him dead in the eye. I reminded him that he had actively weaponized his own wife's emotional well-being to force his parents into my house, completely fabricated a story about a permanent agreement, allowed his mother to steal a house key without permission, and stood directly in my living room with a tape measure planning to tear down my walls. To top it all off, I reminded him that he had tried to manipulate me into believing I was the villain of the story. Tyler stood completely frozen, unable to find a single word to say. I leaned forward and told him exactly what was going to define us moving forward. I stated clearly that his actions were documented forever on a secure server, and if he ever made another attempt to manage, manipulate, or maneuver my family for his own selfish gain, every single one of those audio files would be sent directly to Chloe. Every single sentence and every single word. A look washed over Tyler's face that I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was the terrifying realization of a con man who had fundamentally miscalculated the person across from him. He finally understood that the quiet, retired guy enjoying his waterfront home wasn't slow, soft, or an easy target. He had just been incredibly patient. I asked him if we were completely clear, and he gave a single, rigid nod. I told him to drive safe. They were entirely gone by noon. Sarah came out to the deck and sat down beside me, carrying 2 mugs of the good Ethiopian coffee she only brews for special occasions. We sat together in total tranquility and watched the sunlight hit the water. The early mist had completely dissolved. The Blue Heron had returned to its favorite spot on the dock, sitting absolutely motionless, waiting. Sarah leaned back, took a sip, and admitted that when I first insisted on installing a security system, she genuinely thought I was being paranoid. I smiled, telling her I was just being realistic, while she had been being optimistic. She laughed at that, not the polite, formal laugh she uses when we have company, but the real, deep, unforced laugh that has been my absolute favorite sound in the world for 34 years. We sat there in the perfect quiet until the sun was high in the sky. 6 weeks later, Chloe officially filed for a legal separation. I want to be completely clear about one thing. I didn't celebrate that news. The dissolution of a marriage, even one that desperately needs to end, is never a moment for a victory lap. My daughter was going through immense pain, and her well-being mattered 1,000 times more than me being proven right. But when she came up to the lake house alone that very first weekend, sat out on the deck and let the absolute stillness soothe her mind for a while, she looked over at me with a soft smile. She asked me how I had managed to see through it all so early. I thought about the reading chair Evelyn had shifted, the manipulative tone of Tyler's very first sentence, the smug smile he gave before Sarah even finished speaking, and the sight of him holding that measuring tape. I looked at her and told her it was a mix of intuition and a top-tier camera system. She just shook her head, remarking that I was ready for them the entire time. I told her the honest truth. I wasn't ready. I just paid attention. Just then, little Mason came sprinting down the dock toward us with his arms wide open, completely certain that I would catch him. I did. The heron lifted off the water, its wings catching the bright afternoon light before it disappeared into the sky. The last I heard, Tyler had accepted a position in a completely different city. Arthur and Evelyn were renting a small apartment, one significantly more cramped than they had hoped for. Nobody called to give me these updates directly. I found out through Chloe, who still gets occasional check-in calls from Arthur. I don't really know what the future holds for them, and honestly, I don't waste my time thinking about it. What I do reflect on from time to time is how certain people look at a quiet man who has worked hard his entire life, built something beautiful, and stepped back to enjoy his retirement, and they immediately mistake him for a soft target. They assume he is someone who will constantly absorb the pressure, adjust his boundaries, and accommodate their greed just to avoid a confrontation. What they fail to realize, because quiet people don't boast about it, is that patience is never a sign of weakness. It is preparation. It is meticulous documentation. It is 6 hidden lenses, a secure cloud server, and an audio file with your name written all over it. It is the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the longer you sit back and wait, the more rope they will willingly use to tie their own knots. Retirement, as it turns out, really is the ultimate reward. You just have to be willing to protect it. The waterfront home is completely peaceful again. My reading chair is back in the exact spot I like it. Sarah made her premium potato salad last Saturday, and we enjoyed it out on the deck while Mason chased fireflies, and the water mirrored the very last rays of the evening sun. Nobody measured a single wall. It was, in every single way that truly matters, absolute perfection. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button to support the channel. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic tale of justice.